Characteristics of 20th century music. Characteristics of 20th century music. The most important developments in 20th century classical music was the effective dissolving of tonality. The entire system of keys that dominated the musical landscape since the late Renaissance was dismissed in favor of what would have known as serialism. In the early part of the 20th century, Austrian-born composer Arnold Schoenberg found that he reached a harmonic impasse. Arnold needed a solution that tonality was no longer able to provide. The extreme chromaticism in the music of Richard Wagner made the concept of tonality and tonal centers in music virtually void. Schoenberg invented his own system of musical organization that gave each of the 12 notes chromatic scale equality. This immediately dissolved the tonal system, and with it came a sound world that pushed music into an increasingly dissonant existence. Serialism produced a revolution in musical history that has not been paralleled since. In many ways, it reflected the troubled times that Western Europe was facing. With the advent of the First World War and then in 1939 the start of the Second World War, music became increasingly angular, harsh, and difficult to hear. Even though the music of the late Romantic composers continued in the work of Elgar, Finzi, Britten, Howells, and Sibelius. However, the path that 20th century music was now following was radically different. The orchestra as a medium for outpourings of the 20th century composers continued to be highly popular. The technical demands made by composers on orchestra musicians became extreme, as new principles on many compositions were being conceived. Extended playing techniques became commonplace to expand sonic possibilities and to create more adventurous soundscapes. As the 20th century progressed, electronics were introduced in orchestral settings. This included the use of pre-recorded tapes, synthesizers, amplification, sound manipulation and processing. As a result, not only had the tonal system vanished in these compositions, but the familiar and expected timbres that would traditionally come from an orchestra were altered to a point of being unrecognizable. The complexities of 20th century compositions included sophisticated levels of rhythmic invention. Polyrhythms were a feature of 20th century compositions that generated densely woven textures, to render the option to follow a melody or harmonic progression impossible. While Stravinsky made highly effective use of polyrhythms in his ballet The Rite of Spring, it is still texturally comprehensible. Composers who followed him like Morton Feldman, Michael Finnessy, Elliott Carter, and Brian Ferneyhough derived what was known as the new complexity. Many of the compositions that came from these composers are incredibly challenging to understand. Music began to include completely new systems of tuning, where the division of the octave into 12 equal parts was superseded by microtonal options, including quarter tones and sixth tones. Complexity and experimental music were not the only avenues that composers of the 20th century explored. In the USA, the rise of the minimalist school of composition quickly took hold of many emerging composers as well as audiences. The concept of minimalism was the polar opposite of the composer's aspirations of the new complexity. Minimalism takes its inspiration from Bali and Java's music, and from the sound of the gamelan. It uses the idea of layering ostinati to generate a musical piece. These repeating patterns can be rhythmic and melodic, with their harmonic focus still with its feet in the tonal spectrum. The minimalists employ a wide variety of rhythmic devices to maintain interest in their compositions, including one of the most common, phasing. In essence, this device displaces a musical phrase by a short interval, putting it either behind or in front of any sounding material. It is a kind of Doppler effect. A considerable number of minimalist works explore similar sonorities through entirely new combinations of instruments. Steve Reich's drumming music, 1970-71, is an excellent example of this and inspired composers to visit Ghana. Music for pieces of wood is a further excellent example of the use of a homogeneous ensemble. From the work of many minimalist composers, John Adams has come to a redefinition of music. Some composers like Michael Nyman have made a successful career in the world of film. Other composers delved further into indigenous music from their homeland. Bartók and Vaughan Williams were two composers who spent significant time exploring and recording what can broadly be considered to be folk tunes. Shostakovich included Russian songs in his symphonic works with enormous risk to himself and his family during the reign of Stalin. The French composer Olivier Messiaen turned to birdsong for inspiration. He created his own scheme of harmonic and melodic creations that embodied his deep spirituality. There is an enormous quantity of 20th century music to explore, with something for everyone to discover and enjoy.